Phil Harball, and this is my 86th video discussing British science fiction writers. This video concludes my deep dive into the life and work of my friend and client Sidney J. Bounds. Now, the loss of Sid as my main contributor, along with Philip E. High, prompted me to cancel Fantasy Adventures. I cancelled it with this issue. It's a tribute to both authors. The double-sized last issue, which we see here, number 13, contained my obituaries to them, along with multiple last stories, 7 by Bounds and 4 by High, which we can see from the contents page at the bottom there. The last stories. I still had an immense amount of Sid's work that I'd withheld during his final year, and I was determined to see it reprinted, now working for his estate. I piled in his postponed submissions to Ulverscroft, and all of it sold and was eventually published. I was content to remain anonymous, as I considered that I was partly repaying some of the immense debt I owed Sid. I also edited Seance of Terror, a new collection of his short stories, Dragnet, aka Identity Unknown, and I also sold a superb new detective novel, Boomerang, which I'd asked Sid to write for me. This unusual murder mystery was set around an art school holiday and featured a female detective, and it was based on Sid's own real-life holiday experiences. I also sold his science fiction novels Predator and Star Trail, changing the story to the Eden Mystery. Also sold the Cleopatra Syndicate, which finally saw deserved English publication. We see them there, along with some of his remaining older works, which I'd modernised. In 2007, Stephen Jones published Down Market, one of Sid's last and best new stories in another of his prestigious anthologies, The Mammoth Book of Monsters. And there we see Sid's story, and Stephen wrote a fine obituary to Sid. Continues over the page and the story starts there. The highlight of my agenting Sid's work was the concluding of a lucrative deal for the sale of the film rights to one of his best short stories, The Animators, to QWERTY Films. The story had originally appeared in Tales of Terror from Outer Space in 1975. Which we see again here. It was filmed in 2008 as Last Days on Mars, directed by Rary Robinson, with a screenplay by longtime Bounds fan and television writer Clive Dawson, and starred Liev Schreiber. And here we see Sid's story, The Animators, which was expanded by Clive Dawson into a feature film. And there's Clive signed the copy for me. Best wishes, Clive Dawson. Unfortunately, its central theme of reanimated corpses was blunted by the fact that by 2008, the zombie trope had become grossly overused in films and on television. Critics of the film were unaware that it was based on a story that had been written way back in 1975, long before Hollywood began its wholesale appropriation of the ideas of pioneer science fiction writers.
Please respond.
Mission Control. This is Chief Systems Officer Vincent Campbell speaking.
10 things about Mars you won't miss when you're back on Earth.
Only 10?
Tomorrow is our last day. But I don't know if we're gonna make it home.
happening there?
We found something, sir.
This discovery changes everything.
The entire crew is infected by some sort of bacteria. Something horrible happened here.
Please respond.
The film is available on Netflix and occasionally appears on television. There's likely a pirated version on YouTube as well. But the film is well worth watching. Now in 2010, I renewed contact with Robert Reginald's Borgo Press in the United States. Borgo Books was now an imprint of Wildside Press, and its editor told me he was wide open to publish books and stories from my Cosmos clients, including those of Bounds. Consequently, scores and scores of their Ulverscroft titles were reprinted, along with a great many original first editions. Sadly, Reginald, whose given name was Michael Burgess, died in 2020, and his Borgo Books imprint faded out. But John Betancourt at Wildside Press has continued to print new books and stories by my clients. Here we see just a few of their superb editions of Bounds' works, including a new collection, Time for Murder. Here it is, Time for Murder, and a new edition of the World Records. In 2015, the same thing happened again, this time in England, when I was contacted by the principal editor of a new publisher, Endeavour Press. Over the next 5 years, they've reprinted literally hundreds of my client titles: westerns, science fiction, war stories, and crime and historical fiction, in both paperback and e-book, including many first editions. I was pleased to sell them many Bounds books in all genres, including lots of westerns not shown here, and new UK editions of the best of Sidney J. Bounds, and a first edition of Frontier Legion. That was just a short novel, so I bulked it up to book length by adding a first appearance of another 8 or so stories. Also did Sword of Damocles and The Vanishing Man and Mission of Brains. And both of his two remaining unpublished science fiction novels, Web of Chaos and The Windhaven Effect. Alas, both these two novels were issued, before these two novels were issued, Endeavour was taken over by Loom Books, who concentrated on e-book editions only. So we just see their covers here. Now, more recently, Loom were acquired by Joffe Books, and whilst the imprint has been retained, they too now concentrate entirely on e-books. Fortunately, many of Bounds' earlier Loom book titles in all genres are still available online and from Amazon. During his long writing career, Bounds published hundreds of short stories and almost 4 dozen novels in various genres: science fiction, crime, and westerns. The sheer diversity of his work and the use of pen names has not been conducive to his gaining a high profile and recognition in any one field, but within the writing and editorial fraternity, he was well known and respected as a true professional. He was completely without ego or bombast. He shunned the limelight. He was content with small, steady sales, contenting himself with making just enough money to rub along. He lived alone after his mother died, frugally and modestly, in the same rented house as he'd lived in with his parents as a boy before the war. Because it was a very old house, lacking many modern facilities, the rent was extremely cheap. That suited his purpose, which was simply to write and be his own boss. Astonishingly, he never owned a television set, relying on newspapers and a radio to keep abreast of world affairs, and read extensively in his local library. He also used his old manual typewriter his entire writing career. But he was always fully versed in the latest scientific developments, such as nanotechnology. He really loved the act of creative writing itself, constantly seeking new ideas and methods of expression. Hypercritical of his own writing, he pared it down to an exceptional, lean, economical style, completely eschewing any abundant use of adjectives, which he regarded as padding. But he still managed to infuse it with that elusive quality of readability. Sid once told me, with a rare hint of pride, that a publisher once told him one of his books had a real read-on quality. That to him was the highest form of praise. His writing skills and critical qualities led to his being appointed as a writing tutor to a writer's correspondence school in the 1980s. Bounds worked as a tutor for this writing school for many years, and this was work he loved, encouraging and helping new authors to break into print. He pursued this until the school closed in the late 90s, much to his disappointment. But his legacy lives on in the form of the Best Newcomer Award named after him. Now let me give an example of Sid's professionalism and astuteness. Vision of Tomorrow was launched in 1969 at a time when British magazine science fiction was in the doldrums, and many established authors had simply stopped writing shorter material altogether. As editor of this new magazine, I was desperately short of good material, and so I turned to the older British pro writers such as Ken Bulmer, Bill Temple, Ted Tubb, and not least Sid Bounds, all of whom rallied to my SOS and returned to writing magazine material, especially for me. However, Sid was the only one who sent me very short stories, under 3,000 words. When I queried him why he never sent me any longer stories, he told me that he knew the other authors were writing mostly novelettes or 6,000 worders, and he reckoned that with shorts he would have less competition. And more particularly as an old pro, he knew that magazine editors were always looking for short stories to fill little holes when assembling an issue. He quickly became one of my best and most reliable contributors, and a firm friendship ensued. Another example. When I was selling numerous old 1950s Western paperback novels for reprints to London publishers Robert Hale, by Sid, John Russell Fern, John Glasby, Tony Glynn, Gordon Lansborough, Ted Tubb and others, I was about to submit a 1951 Fern Western, The Hanging Nine. But on reading it before creating the blurb, I discovered that the story did not make sense at 2 points midway through the novel. I soon realised that large chunks of 2 chapters were simply missing. Fern had submitted a standard 40,000 word, 128-page novel, but to save costs, his wretched publishers, Sky Limited, had slashed the novel to fit into a 96-page format without consulting the author and without doing any rewriting. I managed to successfully plug one gap myself, the missing events having been later briefly described retrospectively by one of the characters. But the other blatant gap was completely beyond me. So I sent the book to Sid with an SOS. Could he figure things out? Within a couple of days, Sid had supplied brilliant additions for me that fitted invisibly. I submitted the book and it sold without a hitch. Now here we see just some of that added text. Bear with me. Let's just get the appropriate pages. Right. Now, if you look there and there, in the Skyen edition, we see chapter 2 is truncated at Jonathan T's Magnificent Stetson. Now, our continuance commences on page 34 of the Hale edition and continues as 5 new pages to page 38. And there, a whole new text that I wrote to end the chapter there. And also, again on page 3, bear with me a sec. See, that chapter ended at time being, for the time being, the matter ended. But I added another 2 pages after that. Okay. That's all. From time to time thereafter, I asked Sid to do some revising of a few Fern short stories for me, and he turned in some fascinating work, most notably A Matter of Vibration and Fantasy Annual number 3, which revision had originally been written and accepted for a proposed Mike Ashley anthology that sadly never appeared. There's the story there, Matter of Vibration. Now, as I've said, many of Bound's crime, western and science fiction novels are currently still available from Loom Books. Unfortunately, they're nowadays concentrating on e-books only, but many of Loom's and Borgo Books' earlier paperback editions can still be found online or via Amazon, as can Ulverscroft's long out of print, large print editions. I urge my viewers to seek them out whilst they're still available. This won't last long. Meanwhile, I'm happy to report on 2 new Bound science fiction short stories, The Miniatures and Last Act. The unpublished manuscripts were lost for 2 decades until I found them again. The Miniatures were submitted to Rich Harvey's Bold Venture Press, and it will appear in the July 2026 issue of Pulp Adventures number 49. Both are quintessential Bound stories, very short but packed with a sense of wonder and strong human and alien interest. Last Act has been accepted by Trevor Kennedy's Phantasmagoria magazine here in the UK, and I hope to report more news on this in a future video. Meanwhile, Pulp Adventures number 49 also contains 2 dynamic novelettes from my agency. The Grey Ones by Edmund Glasby, the son of the famous John Glasby, and now well established in his own right. It's another of his gut-wrenching portraits of human cruelty getting its macabre comeuppance in a style he's made his own. The cover story of the Bold Venture magazine is a rousing, hard-boiled adventure story by Norman Firth, Woman of Danger, rescued from post-war pulp obscurity. Its original edition, which we see here in my introduction, is now almost impossible to find. And here we see profiles of the contributors. And there's 2 pages here, 128 and 129. The issue was rounded out with an intriguing non-fiction article by noted pulp author and historian Will Murray, The Pulp X-Men, and 3 good news stories, The Man from Nowhere and The Fall of Sir William, nicely illustrated on the back cover by Rich Harvey via AI, and Judgment at Ruthven Manor, plus the usual news and reviews. Bold Venture, by the way, are currently assembling the next issue of Pulp Adventures, and as the 50th issue, they're aiming to make it an extra special celebratory one. How better to do that than by having a vintage bounce gangster novel as its cover story, Dragnet. I'll be revealing more exciting details about my involvement with that 50th issue in a future video. And finally, we have Sid's latest book, a posthumous first edition, just published by Wildside Press in both ebook and book form. Now, Private Mage is an intriguing series of 13 short stories featuring the cases of a private mage, i.e. Private Eye, Al Weaver. It's set in a parallel world where magic exists, and consequently the physical sciences have been retarded, attaining only the level of Victorian England. John Betancourt has captured that beautifully in his cover image there. And there you will see the 13 stories published in book form for the very first time. The earliest Private Mage stories were initially only published in semi-professional fanzines, and then a UK publisher, Michael O'Mara, commissioned Bounce to collect them as a book, for which he wrote several new stories. Unfortunately, the publication was delayed as the publisher had a large inventory. It's not until 1998 that I learned of these stories and obtained a reversion of the rights so I could publish the book myself in my fledgling Cosmos Books imprint. To my dismay, Sean Wallace, who was then my partner in the publishing company, disliked the stories. He just didn't get their delightful conceit. Consequently, the book, which I purchased personally, was never published at the time. Eventually, Sean and I amicably went our separate ways, but I became so busy with my expanding literary agency that the book was temporarily forgotten. But more recently, I was able to place some of the stories in Wildside's Black Cat ebook magazine, which I've mentioned a few times recently. And their success has prompted editor John Betancourt to now publish the complete collection of 13 stories in book form and in ebook. It's not to be missed, and it's the latest example of the consummate professionalism of Sidney J. Bounce. Having kept my promises to Sid, I rest content.